Chapter 26. Do you know that almost indescribable feeling you sometimes have when you understand in your heart that things are about to get a lot better? There's no real reason to believe it, but you do. There's something that stirs inside of you, and what used to look bleak and cold like a January in Michigan suddenly appears like mid-May in Miami. The existentialist writer Camus said it best. In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. Palmer and Fidrich were both feeling that emotion. Hope was feeling like they'd better make for the park down the street before his table mates started cranking out the contracts and haggling about the season. They'd also better make it to the field before Willie brought up Hope's desire not to attend spring training. They were easily enough ushered out of the restaurant after leaving most of the pizza still on the table, along with a $100 bill, Fidrich's standard tip when he ate at one of his own establishments or anywhere else, really. Palmer's home field truly was just down Amherst from the restaurant, and he pointed out his red brick and brown wood childhood home as they drove by. There it is, 56 Amherst, Pleasant Ridge, Michigan. I can still remember my best friend Bob McMurray's phone number. There's Bob's old house. The other two occupants listened politely to Willie's reverie. There's a certain holiness to visiting shrines of your youth, and the men knew enough not to interrupt or make jokes about the neighborhood of houses jammed up right next to each other, or the lingering smell of the old chemical plant nearby, which was just named a toxic Superfund site. At the end of the block, they turned right and came up to Victory Field. Most people think this park was named Victory, so teams would feel like winners. Actually, during World War II, people used to plant vegetable gardens here because rations were scarce back then, Willie explained. Victory seemed to be the most unlikely name for this field covered in ice, surrounded by a demolition crew dismantling the factory next to it. But the three parked alongside of the field, grabbed the mitts and balls, and quietly marched out into the cold. Since the backstop was all the way across the field from them, they chose the back of the giant metal World War II Quonset hut as their temporary backup catcher. Willie gave Fidrich a catcher's mitt that he had found in his garage, and somehow, from somewhere, Hope produced the tape measure. After handing the rolled-up end to Fidrich, he began walking out into the field with half a dozen baseballs in a small red bucket. "Tell me when it hits 60 and a half," he called over his shoulder. Fidrich stopped him and squatted in the snow. Hope wove another indiscernible smile across his lips, and this time didn't even bother winding up. He just threw the ball at Fidrich's mitt, with absolutely no ceremony. Chapter 27. Galligan wasn't having the best of luck. Her boss, Farina, had just asked her to cruise for features today, and nobody, especially Galligan, really liked that assignment. Newspaper photographers only cruise for features when nothing else is going on or if they're being punished in some way. Nobody in the world would punish Galligan for anything. The award-winning photojournalist was one of the best in the country, and certainly one of the best of her staff of shooters. But when you're out driving through the Detroit suburbs on a day that's nothing short of dismal for picture taking, you start to kind of wonder why you got that assignment and not one of the interns. She earlier had visited a spray ground and shot some scenic, lonely shots showing that a water park looked like in the dead of winter. Isolated. That was a CYA photo, she thought to herself. She covered her ass, but Galligan didn't like to shoot with her butt covered. She was much more into real photojournalism. Real people doing real things. She resented her boss. She resented anyone who made her do otherwise. No, she was going to find anyone doing something outdoors, and she headed over toward the old Reichhold chemical plant that she had heard was being demolished. She remembered when she was a kid walking to school past Reichhold and sometimes feeling droplets of moisture spraying out from the plant. Now that was an extreme spray ground, she said to herself subaudibly. She was glad they were getting rid of the thing, and she thought that pictures of cold workers up against a post-industrial backdrop just might make interesting shots. At least that's how it seemed when she was warm in the office, scrolling through the computer system, looking at reporters' notes and story briefs. She kept her camera and telephoto lens in the trunk, just in case she had to talk her way onto the demolition site. She'd been in the business long enough to know that sometimes people get freaked out if you showed up at a sensitive event with all your gear draped all over your body. Even though there's a world of difference between a news photographer documenting a factory being torn down and a celebrity photog who waits to ambush the newest, hottest stars, people's first reaction, regardless to a shooter, is often, "Get out of here, paparazzi!" Generally speaking, though, construction workers don't appear in Peephole magazine. Photographers are easy targets for people's anger, and ever since a seatbeltless princess died at the hands of a drunk driver who was speeding, the popular culture knee-jerk reaction has been to blame those who make their living making pictures. Nope, I'm keeping my gear in my trunk, and I'll politely talk my way in, thought Galligan. As she drove along Overlook Road, a street built specifically for those who wanted, for some reason, to look at the chemical company back in its heyday, she thought she saw something down in the park nearby. Instinctively, she pulled the windshield washer lever to squirt some solvent onto her window so she could wash the salt away and get a better view. Before 2 swipes of the wipers had passed, Galligan was accelerating toward Victory Field and the 3 people she saw playing. What was it? Catch? Unfortunately, Overlook Road wound around the plant, and while it may have provided a great view of the state-of-the-art 1930s chemical company, it decidedly gave a rotten view of the field that interested Galligan more. But since she grew up in the neighborhood, she knew the way back around. Unfortunately, since she hadn't come back to the old neighborhood recently, there was no way for her to know that they'd closed off and guardrailed her shortcut. No way until she was forced to slam on her brakes and slide fast at first and then slowly, sickeningly slowly toward the metal rail. The Fleet car, one of the oldest ones that the Detroit Daily News used, had no updated safety features like anti-lock brakes. But it did, as of this very moment, have one brand new feature: a big horizontal crease right in the middle of the hood as Galligan slowly skidded to a stop with her car now a few feet on the wrong side of the guardrail. Chapter 28. Maybe it was the loud sound of crunching metal that distracted Mike Fidrich. Maybe it was the 2 or 3 beers that he'd consumed before noon. Or maybe it was the wicked fastball that Hope had just fired at him. Whatever the cause, Fidrich's butt was now the second one that Hope had put in the snow that day. Well, the third if you counted Sparky's. Instead of abandoning Hope, Galligan jumped out of the car and ran around to the trunk to get her gear. Then she ran back to the driver's seat and pulled the forgotten keys out of the ignition. Once again, she ran back to the trunk. With an almost mechanical efficiency, she had her cameras and long lens out and pieced together as she started her snow slog. "They've got to still be there. They've got to still be there," she repeated almost like a mantra she wanted to believe. Even though the park was on the smaller side, as neighborhood parks go, it still held a lot of obstructed views from the road, and Galligan's ever-increasing sense of dis-ease was that she would be sick if she couldn't get this perfect weather feature. Rounding the last little bend in the snow-encrusted path, she saw 3 men at the opposite end of the park, roughly a baseball field away, walking toward their car. Lifting her lens up to get a closer view, Galligan was momentarily tempted to call out and ask them what they were doing in hopes that they would come back and keep doing what they were doing. What were they doing, she wondered. But Galligan's stringent ethics wouldn't allow herself to let them, the subjects, pretend to do what they were doing earlier. It's a slippery slope, almost as slippery as the trail she was walking on. So, with a resigned gesture, she half-heartedly snapped off a couple frames on autofocus and auto exposure without even looking and turned to walk away. As she slogged back down the path, she couldn't help taking a look at the screen on the back of her camera to see what she'd missed. The first shot was the backs of 3 people walking away from her, but it was the second frame that stopped her in her tracks. This shot only had 2 people's backs to her, and the third person seemed to be turned toward her. Galligan used the magnifying function to zoom in on the image. He's smiling at me. Magnifying it all the way and isolating just the third figure, she could look more closely. And wait, is he winking? She heard the distant snow-muffled sounds of 3 car doors closing. She just lost a perfect picture for tomorrow's paper, as well as a great excuse to come in from the cold. She was also mystified by the incongruous wink and smile, not to mention a company car sitting partially under a guardrail not far off. So it was all the more shocking that Galligan wasn't feeling mad or nervous or scared or anything negative. No, that feeling in her gut was altogether different. It was kind of a delightful anticipation mixed with the certainty that things were going to be, inexplicably, a little better.